She has my name now. Jasper Bishop's voice cut through the crowded interior of the Silver Creek Town Hall like a blade drawn clean from its scabbard, and every man in that room felt the edge of it. He stood with his hat in his hand, his dark eyes fixed on Elder Caldwell Price with a steadiness that did not waver, did not blink, did not yield so much as a fraction of an inch. The lamp oil burned low in the wall sconces and cast the gathering of men in amber shadow, and Jasper Bishop looked like something carved from the landscape itself, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, jaw set like a granite shelf above a river gorge. Elder Price sat at the head of the long oak table, his pale hands folded atop the polished wood, his expression carrying the particular brand of superiority that only a man who had never genuinely earned anything could sustain for decades without shame. Around him sat the council of Silver Creek, Texas men of property and comfort, men with interests, men with secrets they kept like coins in locked boxes. "Bishop," Price said, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a man who had learned that tone can accomplish what fists cannot. "The debt belonged to the woman before she arrived in Silver Creek. The town charter is clear. Debts that arrive with a person." "She has my name now," Jasper said again, and his voice did not rise, did not crack, did not carry a single note of desperation. It carried something far more dangerous, conviction. "So every problem of hers is mine." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the shock of a dozen men recalibrating, full of the unspoken understanding that the wealthiest cattle rancher in 3 counties had just drawn a line in the dust of that polished floor, and he had drawn it with absolute clarity. Price's eyes narrowed. Across the table, men shifted in their chairs. Jasper placed his hat back on his head, adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, and looked at the elder with something that was not anger and not warmth, and was somehow more intimidating than either. "Send me the bill in the morning." He walked out into the night air of Silver Creek, and the door swung shut behind him, and the stars over Texas blazed without mercy or apology, and somewhere across town, in a rented room above the feed store, a woman named Josephine Keating, Josephine Bishop now, though neither of them had fully made peace with what that meant, sat in a chair by a window and did not know yet that everything had just changed. But she was about to find out. 3 weeks earlier, the stagecoach from Abilene had rolled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday in late September of 1878, and Josephine Keating had arrived in it the way trouble usually arrived in small towns, quietly, without announcement, and carrying far more than anyone could see from the outside. She was 24 years old with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely back from her face, not out of vanity but out of practicality, because vanity was a luxury she had been unable to afford for several years running. She had green eyes that caught light in a way that made people think she was amused when she was often simply observing, and a mouth that sat in a line that people who did not know her read as coldness, but was in truth the shape that concentration makes on a face when a person is trying very hard not to drown. She carried a worn leather traveling bag and a smaller satchel that contained everything she owned of any value, which was not much: a locket with a miniature portrait of her mother. A letter of introduction she had already determined was largely useless, a ledger of debts that she could not look at without her stomach drawing tight as a cinched saddle. Silver Creek was a town of roughly 400 souls in 1878, sitting in the hill country of central Texas where the land rolled and dipped, and the live oaks spread their dark canopies over limestone outcroppings. It was not a lawless place exactly, but it was a place where the law was administered unevenly, as was the custom in most of Texas in those years, and where men of means had a particular gravitational pull on what was considered just and what was considered settled. Josephine had come to Silver Creek because of a man named Thomas Aldridge, and not for any romantic reason. Thomas Aldridge had been her employer in San Antonio before he died of a fever in the summer, and in dying he had left behind an accounting disaster so complex and so dishonest that Josephine, who had served as his bookkeeper for 2 years, found herself legally entangled in obligations she had not created and could not have anticipated. One of those obligations had a root in Silver Creek, where Aldridge had borrowed money from Elder Caldwell Price's private lending operation at an interest rate that would have made a river pirate blush, and where that debt had, through a series of legal maneuvers that Josephine could not afford a lawyer to challenge, been transferred to her name. She had not fully understood the depth of that trap until she stepped off the stagecoach and was met, within 20 minutes, by Price's personal representative, a thin man named Gerald Oakes who wore his hair oiled back and his smile forward, and who handed her a document and told her she owed the sum of $342 to the Price Lending Trust, payable within 60 days, or the original collateral would be claimed. The collateral, as it turned out, was a small plot of land near the creek outside of town that had belonged to Josephine's aunt, a woman named Clara Keating who had died 2 years prior, and left the land to Josephine and her, land Josephine had never seen, but had held onto the deed of as the last tangible thing her family had ever left her. $342 in 1878 was not a small sum. It was the kind of sum that separated survival from ruin, and Josephine Keating, standing in the afternoon dust of Silver Creek's Main Street, had understood with terrible clarity that she had walked directly into a trap that had been constructed very carefully before she had even arrived. She found lodgings above the feed store, run by a woman named Mrs. Pearl Cutler, who had a round face and suspicious eyes that eventually softened once she established that Josephine was neither frivolous nor foolish. Pearl charged her $1 a week for the room, which was small and clean, with a window that overlooked the street and a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar. Josephine took stock of her situation in the way she always processed difficulty, which was methodically and without self-pity, because self-pity had never once fed her or kept her warm. She had some skills. She could keep books. She could write with clarity and speed. She had a quick mind for numbers. She went to the one small newspaper office in Silver Creek the morning after her arrival and asked the editor, a red-faced man named Wilbur Hatch, if he needed any assistance. He looked her over with the particular assessment that men of that era applied to women who presented themselves for employment in any capacity that was not domestically categorized, and she held his gaze steadily and did not look away until he cleared his throat and said he might have use for someone who could set type and proofread. She said she could do both. She started the next morning. The pay was not enough. She knew within a week that at the rate she was earning, she could not save $342 in 60 days. She would have needed a miracle or a different situation entirely, or both. She had not anticipated Jasper Bishop. Nobody arrived in Jasper Bishop's life in the way that stories usually arrive in lives, with fanfare and clear intention. He had been ranching the Bishop land since he was 19 years old, when his father died and left him a half-built operation and a mortgage that would have crushed a less stubborn man. He had built the Bishop Ranch into the largest cattle operation in that part of Texas, not through luck or inheritance, but through a specific combination of intelligence, physical labor, and a genuine attachment to the land and the animals on it that most men who met him initially mistook for stubbornness and eventually recognized as something closer to integrity. He was 31 years old in the fall of 1878, and he was the sort of man who had been told so often by so many different people that he should marry and settle further into respectability, that the suggestion had begun to bounce off him the way water bounces off oilskin. It was not that he was opposed to the idea of partnership or love or family in the abstract. It was that he had watched too many people around him enter into the institution of marriage as a transaction, a merging of properties, a social contract, a remedy for loneliness that often created a different and subtler form of it, And he had a private standard that he had never spoken aloud because it would have sounded naive to most of the people he knew. He wanted something real. He came to Silver Creek every 2 weeks to handle business supplies for the ranch, negotiations at the bank, correspondence with cattle buyers in San Antonio and Austin. He was a known figure in the town, respected in the way that a man with significant resources and an uncomplicated reputation tends to be respected, and he was generally liked, though he was not a man who courted approval or spent much energy on social performance. He was at the feed store on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October, arranging a delivery order with old Thomas Cutler, Pearl's husband, when Josephine came down the stairs from her room above. She was carrying a stack of papers that she held against her chest with one arm, and she was reading something over the top of them while walking, which was the kind of thing that a person with a lot on her mind does without realizing it creates a collision hazard, and she walked directly into Jasper Bishop. The papers went to the floor in a scatter. Josephine took a step back and looked up, and the first thing she registered was that the obstacle was considerably larger and more solid than she had expected. And the second thing she registered was that it was looking at her with dark eyes that held a quality she could not immediately name, but that was distinct from the usual range of expressions she received from strangers, which ran mostly between dismissiveness and presumption. "I beg your pardon," she said, because she had been raised with certain forms even when everything else had been stripped away. "My fault," he said, and bent to collect the papers from the floor with the unhurried efficiency of a man who was genuinely trying to help rather than performing helpfulness. He handed the stack back to her, and she took it and thanked him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the narrow space of the feed store, and something happened in that moment that neither of them would have been able to articulate if asked to describe it, which is perhaps why neither of them tried. "You're staying upstairs," Jasper said. It was not a question exactly, more an observation offered as a point of shared reference. "I am," Josephine said. "Josephine Keating. Jasper Bishop." He touched his hat brim. "You arrived last week. Tuesday," she said. "Are you a man who keeps track of arrivals?" "Only in a town this size," he said, "where a new face means something happened." She considered that and then said, "Something happened." He waited, and she appreciated that he waited because most people in her experience filled silences with words, and most of those words were about themselves. "I'm working at the newspaper," she said. "And I'm attempting to resolve a financial situation that I walked into rather naively." "Price," he said. The directness of the guest surprised her. She looked at him with slightly more attention. "Is it that obvious?" "Anyone arriving in Silver Creek with a financial problem that was generated elsewhere," Jasper said carefully, "has usually had some contact with Price's lending arrangements. He has a long reach and a particular talent for positioning himself at the end of it." Josephine studied him. There was nothing theatrical in his warning, no performance of rescue, no implication that she needed him to manage anything. He was simply being informative, the way a person who knows the terrain is informative to someone who does not. "Thank you for the context," she said. "I'm going to find my own way through it." "I don't doubt it," he said. She went out the door, and Jasper Bishop watched the space where she had been for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then turned back to his delivery order with Thomas Cutler and did not mention it. But he thought about it. He thought about it on the ride back to the ranch that afternoon, which was a 12-mile journey through country he knew so well he could ride it in his sleep, which meant his mind had the freedom to go where it liked. And where it liked to go was back to the feed store, and the woman with the green eyes and the papers and the quiet, precise way she had said, "I'm going to find my own way through it," not as a declaration of independence, but simply as a statement of intention. The way a person says, "I will take the left road," as a fact about what is going to happen. He came back to town the following week on legitimate business, but he found himself at the newspaper office at midday, which was not entirely necessary, but was not entirely without purpose either. Josephine was at the typesetting case when he arrived, and she looked up with a question in her expression, and he told her he needed to place a notice about a lost steer, which was true, and she took the notice and wrote it down in clean, efficient handwriting, and then said, "I looked into the original lending agreement between Thomas Aldridge and the Price Trust." Jasper settled against the doorframe. "What did you find?" "That it contains a provision that I believe was fraudulently attached after the original document was signed," she said, and she said it with the precision of someone who had looked at it very carefully. "There's a clause that extends liability to associates of the borrower, and the word associates has been defined in a way that appears in no standard lending document I've ever seen, and I've seen a considerable number." "You were a bookkeeper," he said. "For 2 years in San Antonio, yes." "Can you prove the fraud?" "Not without a lawyer," she said, "and not without funds I currently do not have." She said it without self-pity, purely as information. Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a lawyer in Austin, a man named Harlow, who does this kind of work. Contract disputes, fraudulent additions to documents. He's won cases against worse operations than Price's." Josephine looked at him directly. "I appreciate the information. I can't afford Austin rates." "I know," he said. And that was all he said about it that day. But on the way back to the ranch that evening, he was already working out in his mind what could be done, because the injustice of the thing was not abstract to him. Price had been operating this particular scheme for years, importing debt into Silver Creek attached to vulnerable people who arrived without local standing or resources, and then collecting on it through the force of the town charter's provisions about property claims. Jasper had watched it happen to others, and had felt the friction of it without having a clear point of intervention. Josephine Keating's situation was not unique in its type, but it was unique in its specific gravity for him in a way he was not yet ready to examine. He visited the newspaper office twice the following week. Once for the legitimate purpose of checking on the notice about the steer, which had been found, and once for the less legitimate purpose of finding out whether the woman who occupied his thoughts more than he considered strictly reasonable was doing all right. She was doing all right in the way that very determined people do all right, which is to say she was keeping her head above water through sheer force of effort while the current was still working against her. She had taken on additional bookkeeping work for 2 of the local merchants, keeping their accounts in the evenings, and she was eating simply and sleeping poorly and looking at her ledger with the focused attention of someone trying to solve an equation that does not quite balance. On the 3rd week of October, a Thursday afternoon, it rained hard and steady, the kind of Texas autumn rain that comes sideways off the hills and makes the street mud and the rivers urgent. Josephine had finished her work at the newspaper and was sheltering under the overhang of the general store, waiting for a break in the rain when Jasper rode in from the ranch, and saw her there, and tied his horse, and came to stand under the same overhang without making a large ceremony of it. They stood for a while watching the rain, and he asked her about her family, which was not a usual question from him. And she told him about her mother who had died when Josephine was 16 and her father who had been a school teacher in Missouri and had also died of a heart ailment when Josephine was 20, and about the Aunt Clara who had left her the land, and about the years since in which she had made her own way with her own abilities and a fairly clear understanding of what the world was willing to offer a woman on her own with no money and no connections. "It doesn't sound like you're bitter about any of it," he said. "Bitterness is expensive," she said. "I've never been able to afford it." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, not a polite one, the kind that happens when something strikes a person as genuinely true and surprising. And Josephine felt something shift slightly in her chest at the sound of it, not a large shift, but a perceptible one, like a door that has been closed so long you've forgotten it exists, moving a fraction on its hinges. "What about you?" she asked, because fairness seemed appropriate. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he said, "I built something from nothing, or close enough to nothing that the difference doesn't matter much. My father was not a careful man with money. I was left with land and debt and about 200 head of cattle that needed a full year of work before they'd be profitable. He paused. I made it work. You sound as though you're almost surprised by that, she said. He looked at her. I was 21 the year I turned it around. Looking back, I don't know exactly how I did it. At the time, I just did it because there wasn't another option I was willing to accept. The rain was beginning to ease and they both knew it, and Josephine straightened and prepared to leave, and Jasper said, Miss Keating, would you have dinner with me? At the hotel dining room Friday evening if you're willing. She looked at him with the careful, measuring look that was her default when encountering something new that required assessment, and he held her gaze and did not look away or rush to fill the silence, and she said, Yes, I would. Friday evening, they sat across from each other in the modest dining room of the Silver Creek Hotel, which had 4 tables and a menu that ran to beef and potatoes, and whatever pie misses. Dawson had made that day, which was apple, and Josephine ate with appetite because she had been eating sparingly all week to save money, and because the apple pie was genuinely good, and Jasper watched her eat with an expression that he kept carefully neutral but that contained, for the first time in a long while, a quality of warmth that had not been there before. They talked for 2 hours. About cattle and bookkeeping, and about Texas, and about the particular nature of a place that is simultaneously a landscape of tremendous freedom and of tremendous injustice, the way the two things existed side by side without apparent contradiction. Josephine had opinions about everything and delivered them without apology, not aggressively but simply as opinions she had thought through and arrived at honestly. And Jasper found that he was not only listening but was interested in the listening, which was different from the polite attention he usually paid to conversation. She found out that he read not just the Cattleman's Weekly or the land grants but novels, and a particular fondness for natural history, and she found that this surprised her in a way that she was slightly ashamed of, because it revealed an assumption she had carried without examining it, and she told him so directly, and he laughed again, and the door in her chest moved another fraction. He walked her back to the feed store after dinner, and they stood in the mild night air of early autumn, and she thanked him, and he said the pleasure had been entirely his, and they were both being precise rather than polite. And she went upstairs and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the dark street and felt, for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, something other than the grinding, mechanical anxiety of her situation. She felt the faint, cautious beginning of something she was not yet willing to name. The weeks that followed built on themselves the way certain things build, not with the loud rush of a sudden spring flood, but with the quiet, steady, irresistible accumulation of water in a limestone cistern, filling from below, invisible from the outside until it is full. Jasper came to town more often than his schedule strictly required, and Josephine did not pretend not to know why, because she was not a woman who hid from clear facts. They rode out along the creek on a Saturday morning when Josephine's work schedule permitted it, and he showed her the stretch of land that had belonged to her Aunt Clara, the parcel that was now under threat, and she stood at the edge of the live oaks and the grassy slope that ran down to the water and felt the specific grief of almost owning something beautiful. It's good land, Jasper said quietly, standing a few feet away. I know, she said. I know without knowing anything about land that it's good land. She was quiet for a moment. I am going to keep it, he believed her. That was the thing about Jasper Bishop and Josephine Keating. He believed her when she said things, not because she was easy to believe, but because she had an absolute consistency between what she said and what she meant, and he had been around enough people who did not have that quality to recognize and value it precisely. It was on the ride back from the creek that he told her about the specifics of the price operation in more detail, the cases he had seen, the families who had lost property, the particular machinery of it, Price's network of associates in larger cities, who identified vulnerable individuals with property interests in Silver Creek. Price's contacts in the legal community who made the fraudulent document modifications look legitimate. The use of the town council, which Price effectively controlled through favors and pressure to enforce the resulting claims. Josephine listened to all of it and then said, "Has anyone ever challenged him directly, through the council?" "A few times," Jasper said. "It never went anywhere because no one who challenged him had enough standing to override the council's deference to him. He's been the primary economic engine of this town for 15 years. He holds mortgages on half the property in Silver Creek." He paused. "Including some of mine from years back. Paid off now, but I remember the weight of it." "So he's untouchable," she said. "Inside Silver Creek mostly," Jasper said. "But if the fraud in the original document could be proved and presented to a district judge rather than the town council, that's different territory." Josephine was quiet with thought. "The lawyer in Austin you mentioned, Harlow." "Yes." "If I had the funds," she said carefully, "do you think he would take the case?" "I think he would," Jasper said. "But Josephine," he said her name directly, which he had started doing somewhere in the past 2 weeks, and every time he said it she was briefly aware of it as a point of warmth. "The 60 days run out in the 3rd week of November. Even working around the clock, you can't save enough to pay for the lawyer and retain the land before the deadline." "I know," she said. "I've done the arithmetic 11 times." He was quiet for a long stretch of riding, and the horses moved at an easy walk through the dry grass, and the afternoon light fell gold and long across the hill country. And Josephine looked at the distance and thought about arithmetic and impossibility, and the specific quality of being a woman in 1878 Texas who needed help and hated needing it. Not out of false pride, but because every time she had needed help in her life, the cost of it had been greater than the help itself. "I want to propose something," Jasper said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, and his voice had the careful quality of someone who has chosen their words with attention. "I want to propose that we marry. Formally, legally, and honestly. Not as a transaction you are required to accept or as charity offered with conditions. As a genuine proposal between two people who have spent time together and who, unless I am very badly misreading the situation, have found something in each other worth pursuing further." Josephine's hands were still on the reins. "If we marry," Jasper continued, "the debt becomes mine by law. I can settle it directly, and then pursue the fraud claim in Austin at my own expense as a property matter, because the land sits on the boundary of the Bishop Range and I have standing. And you would have what you have been building toward, a position here, roots, a piece of this country that was meant to be yours." He paused and then said very quietly, "And I would have something I did not expect to find." The silence stretched long enough that a hawk circled overhead and disappeared into the blue sky. "You should understand," Josephine said finally, her voice careful and even, "that I do not do things by half measures. If I marry you, Jasper Bishop, it is because I mean it. Not because it is convenient, not because I am grateful, not as a form of obligation. If I agree to this, it is because when I sit with the idea of it, I find that I want it for its own sake, independent of the circumstances. I would not want it otherwise," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the afternoon light, and he met her eyes and waited, and she found that, when she sat with the idea of it, she did indeed want it for its own sake, had been wanting something like it for longer than she had admitted to herself, and that the wanting did not feel desperate or transactional but clear and genuine and true in a way that very few things in her life had been clear and genuine and true all at once. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jasper, I will." They were married at the Silver Creek Courthouse on a Monday morning in the last week of October, with Thomas and Pearl Cutler as witnesses. The justice of the peace, a deliberate man named Holloway, read the ceremony with the solemnity it deserved, and Josephine wore the best dress she owned, which was dark green wool that she had pressed the night before, and Jasper wore his good jacket and a white shirt. And when the ceremony was concluded and the documents were signed, He looked at her with the dark, serious eyes that she had come to understand contained entire provinces of feeling that he expressed through action rather than speech. And she understood something that she was certain of even then, standing in a courthouse in Central Texas in 1878, that she was not making a mistake. Afterward, over coffee at the hotel, Pearl Cutler pressed Josephine's hand and looked at her with eyes that were absolutely no longer suspicious and said, "He's a good man, Josephine. He's one of the good ones." And Josephine said, "I know, Pearl. I figured that out fairly quickly." Jasper had arranged for Josephine's things to be brought to the ranch while they were at the courthouse, and when they drove out there in the late afternoon, it was Josephine's first visit to the Bishop Ranch, and she saw a sprawling property with a main house built of limestone and cedar that was large and solid and alive with work. The sounds of cattle and horses, the smell of hay and open air, 3 ranch hands who tipped their hats to her with varying degrees of visible surprise and genuine respect, and a house with a front porch that looked out at a view of the hill country that in the late afternoon light was the kind of thing that makes people understand why certain landscapes become beloved. She stood on the porch and looked at it, and Jasper stood beside her, and she said, "Your father built this house." "I built most of it," he said. "The bones were his. I added the porch and the east room." She turned to look at the house and said, "It's real. I mean, it has substance. It feels like something that was built with intention." "It was," he said. They had dinner that first evening at the long kitchen table that Jasper had made himself years ago from cedar, a table built for more people than currently sat at it, and Josephine ate the beef stew that Jasper cooked with a confidence that told her he had been feeding himself for a long time, and they talked with the ease of people who have already established the essential quality of each other's character and are now simply adding detail. And later Josephine stood at the window of the upstairs room that was hers and looked at the dark sky over Texas, thick with stars, and felt something settling in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. That night before she slept, she thought about the arithmetic of gratitude and obligation and desire and genuine feeling, and she found that when she tried to isolate one from the other she could not, because they had already become the same thing. The way water and clay become the same thing when you work them together, not confused but unified and stronger for it. The next morning, Jasper rode to Silver Creek and paid Gerald Oakes $342 from his own account and told Oakes to deliver Price a message that the debt was cleared and the land attached to it was unambiguously Bishop property now, and that if any further document materialized claiming otherwise, Jasper would be in contact with his lawyer in Austin that same day. Oakes received this message with the visible discomfort of a man in the employ of someone who is not accustomed to clean answers, and reported it to Elder Price, and that afternoon Price called a council meeting, which was where the story that had opened in that lamplight meeting hall began, because Price was not a man who accepted clean answers without attempting to complicate them. The emergency council meeting was convened that same evening, and Price had prepared his counterargument with the efficiency of someone who had been ready for a version of this moment for a long time. He had documents. He always had documents. The specific document he produced that evening claimed that the original debt carried a penalty clause for early settlement by a third party, a clause that more than doubled the amount owed under circumstances exactly like the ones Jasper had just created. It was at that meeting that Jasper Bishop had stood before the oil lamplit council in Caldwell Price and delivered the words that would be repeated in Silver Creek for years afterward. "She has my name now, so every problem of hers is mine." He had walked out and sent word to Austin that night, a telegram to Harlow's office requesting immediate correspondence, and had ridden home through the October dark with a clarity about what needed to happen that was completely separate from any personal anger, though the anger was present, running beneath the clarity like the current below a still surface. Josephine was awake when he arrived back at the ranch. She had lit a lamp in the front room and was sitting at the table with her ledger, working on the books for two of the Silver Creek merchants, and she looked up when he came in and read his face with the speed of someone who has learned to read situations rather than relying on others to explain them. He had a backup plan, she said. A penalty clause, Jasper said. He sat down across the table from her and told her exactly what had been said at the meeting. He did not soften any of it, and she did not need him to. She asked precise questions about the specific document Price had produced and listened to the answers, and then opened her own ledger to a clean page and began writing. The original lending agreement had no penalty clause, she said, writing as she spoke. I have the copy that was served to me when I arrived. It is a copy of the original because it shows the notary mark from San Antonio where Aldrich signed it. Any penalty clause added to the version Price presented tonight was added after that notarization. Jasper looked at the page she was writing. Can you prove that? I can prove that my copy, notarized in San Antonio in June of this year, has no penalty clause, she said. That creates a direct contradiction with whatever Price showed the council tonight. A district judge will not be able to ignore a direct contradiction between two versions of the same notarized document. Jasper was looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read, and would spend a long time learning because there were many provinces in it, but she could already identify the one that was currently predominant, which was a kind of profound recognition, the way you look at a landscape you have seen before and suddenly understand for the first time why you have always come back to it. Send the telegram to Harlow tonight, she said. Send both copies of the document with the next post. Already sent the telegram, he said. She looked at him. I sent it before the meeting, he said. I knew Price would have something prepared. And something happened to Josephine's face then, something she could not control and did not try to, a softening that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the specific effect of being understood, genuinely and practically understood, by another person. She had been managing alone for so long that the sensation of not being alone was almost physical in its impact. She did not say anything immediately, and neither did he, and the lamplight burned steadily in the front room of the Bishop Ranch house, and outside the October wind moved through the live oaks with a sound like the patient breath of the landscape. Thank you, she said finally, and meant it with the full weight of everything those two words could carry. You're my wife, Josephine, he said, simply and without any performance of nobility, just as a statement of orientation. What happens to you matters to me. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, Jasper. I want you to know that I am not, that this is not. She stopped and began again, with the precision of someone determined to be honest about something that matters. When I agreed to marry you, I told you it was for its own sake. I want you to understand that I meant that. I did not marry you because I was desperate. I married you because I looked at you and saw a person I wanted to know and knew and be known by. The situation, what you've done for me tonight, what Price is doing, none of that changes the original fact for me. Jasper looked at her for so long that she wondered if she had said something wrong, and then he rose from his chair and came around the table and stood next to her and offered his hand, and she took it, and he said, I know. I knew that before you said it. He paused. I am glad you said it. They stood in the lamplight with their hands connected, and the wind outside and the stars over Texas, and what had begun as a marriage of practical construction became, in that moment, something else entirely, something genuine and chosen, and without reservation, the way certain things become final and certain not through ceremony, but through the specific quality of the moment in which two people look at each other and know. The following weeks were a combination of legal maneuvering and the daily reality of two people learning to share a life. Harlow, the Austin lawyer, replied within days of receiving Jasper's telegram and the comparison documents, and his reply was optimistic and specific. He identified 4 separate anomalies in the version of the document that Price had presented to the council, not just the penalty clause but irregularities in the typeface, in the spacing of the notary section, and in a date notation that was in a format that did not exist at the time the document was purportedly created. Harlow filed an application for a district court hearing and Price was notified. And for the first time in Josephine's experience of him, the elder's smooth operations showed visible friction. Price responded by attempting to call in a mortgage he held on property belonging to one of the council members, Walter Sims, who had shown the first signs of wavering in his loyalty to the elder after Jasper's declaration at the meeting. This move backfired in the particular way that overreach tends to backfire. It made visible to Sims and to others the punitive mechanism that lay beneath Price's influence, and two other council members began having quiet conversations with Jasper that would, in the coming months, restructure the composition of the council's loyalties entirely. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Josephine and Jasper were building something day by day that had nothing to do with legal battles and everything to do with the accumulation of ordinary moments, the kind that become the actual substance of a life. She worked with him on the ranch's accounting, which had been kept adequately but not with the efficiency she could apply to it, and in the first 2 weeks she identified 3 areas where costs could be reduced and one where an investment would return considerable profit within a year. And when she presented this to Jasper, he sat with it quietly and asked intelligent questions and then said, "How did you see the third one?" "I've been looking at those supply contracts for 3 years and didn't see it." "You were looking at the individual contracts," she said. "I was looking at the pattern across all of them." "I would like you to always look at the pattern," he said. She smiled, the full wide smile that she reserved for moments of genuine pleasure, which he had already identified as the most valuable thing he could earn on any given day, and they sat together at the cedar table and mapped out the coming year's supply strategy while the November wind blew outside and the cattle moved in the fields beyond the window. He read to her in the evenings. He had said he read, and she had believed him. But the reality of it was better than the stated fact. He read with genuine feeling, not performatively but simply as someone who encounters language with all of himself. And he would read from whatever book was current and occasionally pause and say something about it, and she would respond. And the conversations that grew from those pauses were among the richest she had ever had, layered and unhurried and genuinely exploratory. She began to know his silences as well as his words, because Jasper Bishop communicated in both. There was the silence of thinking, which was contained and inward and had a slight furrow to it. There was the silence of satisfaction, which was expansive and still, the silence he had at the end of a good day's work looking out from the porch at the country he had built. And there was the silence that she came to think of as simply presence, the kind that happens when 2 people are in the same space and the space is enough, and neither of them needs to fill it. He had this last kind of silence with her from very early on, and she recognized it from her own experience of him and understood it as the kind of intimate language that takes years to develop with most people, and with some people arrives almost immediately, like a door that opens on the first try because it was built for you all along. She fell in love with him in November, though she understood that the falling had begun in October in the feed store, or on the porch in the rain, or on the ride back from the creek when she had said yes and meant it with her whole self. The falling was not a single moment but a completed process that she recognized only when it was already entirely done, like looking up and realizing that the landscape has been beautiful all along, and you simply forgot to notice until this moment because you were too busy surviving. He fell in love with her in the way that people fall when they have been waiting without knowing it, with complete conviction and no apparent surprise, as though the thing had always been the case, and he was simply finally aware of it. He said it to her first, on a cold November morning when the frost was on the grass and they were standing on the porch with coffee in the early light, and he said it the way he said all the things that mattered, quietly and directly, and without any softening of it to make it safer. "I am in love with you, Josephine." She looked at him, this man who had walked into her disaster without flinching, who had offered her partnership when she needed it, and given her honesty when honesty is the rarest gift, who read novels and knew the land and laughed a real laugh and built tables from cedar with his own hands and stood up in front of councils and said, "She has my name now, so every problem of hers is mine." And she felt every chamber of her heart acknowledge what her mind had already understood. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time." He looked at her with the expansive, still silence of the third kind, the presence kind, and the November light came pale and golden over the hills. And he leaned down and kissed her in the frost-crisp morning on the porch of the house they were building into a home. And it was the kind of kiss that is quiet but absolute, the kind that lands like a key in a lock, the kind that means something permanent has been confirmed. The district court hearing was scheduled for early December in the town of Careville, which was the county seat. Harlow came up from Austin on the Wednesday before the hearing and met with Jasper and Josephine at the ranch. And Josephine had already prepared a complete documented analysis of the two versions of the lending agreement with annotations on each irregularity. And Harlow sat across the cedar table from them and looked through it and said, with the dry satisfaction of a lawyer who has been handed excellent ammunition, "Mrs. Bishop, this is precisely what I needed." She noticed that he called her Mrs. Bishop and felt the name settle into her not as a reduction of who she had been but as an addition. She was still Josephine Keating in her bones, all the years of making her own way and making herself who she was, and she was also Josephine Bishop, which was a name that now carried weight in this landscape, the weight of Jasper's integrity and his land and his cedar table and his real laughter, and she found that carrying both felt entirely right. The hearing lasted 2 days. Price appeared with a San Antonio attorney of considerable reputation named Creighton, who was smooth and experienced, and who attempted 3 separate legal strategies to discredit the comparison documents. Harlow dismantled each one with the annotated analysis Josephine had prepared, and when Josephine was called to testify about the circumstances of receiving the debt notification and the documents that had accompanied it, she spoke with the clear, factual precision that was her nature. And the district judge, a man named Abercrombie who had the look of someone who had not been surprised in 20 years but was approaching surprise now, asked her 3 follow-up questions and received 3 equally clear answers. On the second day of the hearing, Judge Abercrombie issued his ruling. The penalty clause was fraudulent. The version of the document Price had presented to the Silver Creek Town Council was materially altered from the original notarized agreement. The original debt had been settled in full by Jasper Bishop on behalf of his wife, and the settlement was legally complete. The land along the creek was unambiguously Bishop property. And because Harlow had been thorough in his filing, the ruling also contained a directive that Price's lending operation be subject to review by the district court, which opened the door to every other case that had proceeded under the same fraudulent methodology. Price did not speak during the reading of the ruling. He sat beside his attorney with the contained stillness of a man who has finally run out of maneuvering room, and Josephine watched him from across the courtroom and felt not triumph exactly, but something cleaner. The feeling of a thing being set right that had been wrong, the moral satisfaction of justice arriving in a form you can hold and verify. She and Jasper drove back to Silver Creek that evening through the December country, the cedar and oak dark against the deep blue of the late sky. And somewhere along that 12-mile road in the dusk, she reached over and took his hand where it rested on his knee, and he turned his palm over and held hers, and they rode the rest of the way home without a word because everything that needed to be said between them was already known, and the quiet was more eloquent than any of it. The months that followed the ruling saw Silver Creek in a state of gradual reorganization that was uncomfortable in places and overdue in others. Three of the families who had lost property to Price's schemes over the previous decade filed district court petitions under the precedent established by the Bishop case, and two of them were decided favorably. Walter Sims and two other council members formally distanced themselves from Price's influence, and at the Springtown Council elections, a new slate of members was seated that did not include Elder Price in any capacity. For the first time in 15 years, the elder did not hold the balance of the council, and Silver Creek felt the shift the way a landscape feels the first real rain of spring, with a loosening of everything that had been drawn too tight. Price himself, having lost the court case and the council, retreated into a kind of diminished private life that was its own form of consequence. His lending operation was placed under district supervision, and he was required to repay several of the fraudulent fees he had collected. He remained in Silver Creek because he had nowhere particular to go, but he was no longer the gravitational center of the town's economic life, and his morning walks down the main street no longer caused the particular tension in people's shoulders that they once had, and in a small town, that kind of ambient relief is its own significant change. Josephine went to Wilbur Hatch at the newspaper and told him she was leaving the typesetting position, but offered instead to contribute a weekly column on legal and financial matters affecting the residents of Silver Creek, written in plain language for non-specialist readers. Hatch, who had grown considerably less red-faced in his appreciation of Josephine's abilities over the preceding weeks, agreed immediately, and the column ran for 3 years and became one of the most read features of the paper, particularly among women, which Josephine noted with satisfaction, and which prompted several conversations she had with Pearl Cutler and other women in town about the broader question of what resources and recourses were available to people who arrived in small towns, with outstanding conversations that, slowly and imperfectly, and with more obstacles than anyone would have chosen, began to make a difference in how Silver Creek handled certain kinds of disputes. At the ranch, the early months of 1879 were a time of building, not the emergency construction of lives under pressure, but the deliberate, joyful building of a life that two people have chosen together with their eyes open. Josephine took over the full financial management of the Bishop Ranch operation, and under her administration, the ranch's profits increased 20% in the first year, which Jasper credited entirely to her, and which she credited to the combination of her analysis and his deep knowledge of the land and the cattle, which was a precise and accurate assessment. She learned to ride properly that spring, not the side-saddle performance that women were conventionally expected to make of it, but the practical cattle country style that Jasper rode, astride and efficient, and she took to it with the same application she brought to everything. And within 3 months, she could ride the full perimeter of the ranch without losing her confidence, and by summer she was riding with Jasper on the longer cattle checks, with a sense of physical freedom in the open air that was entirely new to her and entirely good. She learned the land, the limestone ridges and the creek beds and the particular quality of the light at different hours and in different seasons, and the way the cattle moved in different weather, and the names and personalities of the horses, and the rhythm of the working ranch, the early mornings and the physical labor, and the satisfactions that come with work done in connection with living things and actual ground. It suited her in ways she had not anticipated, as though some part of her that had been constructed in abstract spaces, offices and boarding rooms and the interiors of coaches, had always contained a latent knowledge of what the outdoors and the land could mean. She and Jasper had the particular happiness of people who chose each other for good reasons, and then found, in the day-to-day reality of the choice, that the good reasons were even better than anticipated. They disagreed on things, because they were both people with convictions and neither of them collapsed in the face of a differing opinion, but their disagreements had the quality of genuine engagement rather than conflict, two minds working on something together from different angles, and they usually arrived at something better than either of them had started with. He surprised her regularly. The novel she found on her pillow one morning, a new edition she had mentioned wanting, brought in from Austin. The way he handled the ranch hands, with a fundamental respect that was uncommon enough in 1879 Texas, that the three men who worked the Bishop Ranch stayed for years, and worked with a quality of investment that casual observers attributed to loyalty, and those who looked more carefully understood was mutual regard. The evening he spent 3 hours helping old Thomas Cutler repair a fence on property that was not his and not adjacent to his, and for which he asked nothing and expected nothing, because Thomas Cutler was 72 years old and could not do it alone. She surprised him as well. The way she could look at a number and see what it meant about the story of a business, not just the immediate calculation but the narrative the numbers contained. The depth of her response to music, which she revealed on an evening when a traveling musician played at the hotel saloon, and she sat listening with an absorption that was private and complete, and that he watched with a feeling he could not name precisely, but that was somewhere in the territory of reverence. The morning she rode out alone to the creek property, her Aunt Clara's land, now Bishop land, preserved and clear, and sat there for an hour in the early light, and when she came back she said simply, "I think I understand my aunt now. Why she stayed here," and there was peace in her face that had not always been there. In the late summer of 1879, Josephine told Jasper she was expecting a child, and she told him the way she told him everything that mattered, directly and looking at him, and without any management of the information for effect. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and the feeling in his face was so complete and so genuine that she felt it as its own kind of statement. And then he said her name in the way he said it when it meant something large, which was quietly and as though it were the whole of what he needed to say. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to know, not because she was uncertain. "I am so happy I don't have a word for it," he said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said, "completely." Their son was born in the spring of 1880, in the bedroom of the limestone house on the Bishop Ranch, delivered by the town's physician, a reliable man named Dr. Elias Frayne, who had been practicing in Silver Creek for 9 years, and who came out on a Tuesday morning in April, when the bluebonnets were covering the hillsides in that extravagant blue that makes the Texas spring feel like something the landscape is doing deliberately, out of abundance. The boy arrived with considerable announcement, and was healthy and loud, and immediately opinionated about his situation, which Jasper said was entirely Josephine's influence and Josephine said was entirely his. They named him Samuel after no one in particular, but because the name had weight and simplicity and sounded like what it was, a real name for a real person. Samuel Bishop was from the beginning a child of the land he was born on, curious and physical and loud in the ways that mattered, and Jasper held him in the first hour with an expression of such undefended tenderness that Josephine, lying in the bed with the April light coming through the window and the bluebonnets on the hills beyond, felt the completeness of what they had built in a way that was different from any individual happiness she had known, a fullness that included everything that had come before. The losses and the hardships and the trap of the debt, and the feed store and the rainy porch and the courthouse and the November morning, when he had said "I am in love with you," as though all of it had been necessary to arrive exactly here. Pearl Cutler came out to the ranch 3 days after Samuel was born and sat with Josephine for an afternoon, and held the baby with the practiced competence of a woman who has held many babies, and said to Josephine, with the round face and the eyes that were absolutely warm now, "You look like someone who has found her place." "I have," Josephine said. "Exactly." The years between 1880 and 1883 built the Bishop Ranch into something that was notable even in a county full of working ranches. The combination of Jasper's deep knowledge and physical dedication to the land and Josephine's financial strategy and analytical approach produced results that were the practical embodiment of what a genuine partnership looks like, when two people bring different and complementary strengths to the same goal. They added a herd of breeding cattle in 1881 that doubled their long-term production capacity, a decision that had been Josephine's financial analysis and Jasper's read of the market, and they hired 2 additional ranch hands and built a proper bunkhouse, and the operation that Jasper's father had left half-built and burdened became, under the 2 of them, something solid and growing and theirs. Samuel grew into a boy who was utterly himself, talkative and curious, and physically fearless in the way that children who grow up on ranches tend to be, climbing everything and investigating everything and asking questions in rapid succession that often caught adults off guard with their precision. He had Josephine's green eyes and Jasper's dark hair, and a combination of both their natures that was distinct from either, the particular emergence of a third person from 2, which is one of the genuinely mysterious things in a life. He called both of them by their proper titles, Mama and Papa, and the weight of those words on Josephine's ear never diminished. They landed with the same resonance at 3 years old as they had at 8 months, which was when he first said them, and which each time recalled the feed store and the rainy porch and November frost, and the idea that your life can pivot on a Tuesday when you walk into someone you did not expect. In the autumn of 1882, the district court completed its final review of the price lending operation and issued a comprehensive ruling that dissolved the trust entirely and required the return of fraudulently collected fees to 16 families who had been affected over the 14 years of its operation. Elder Caldwell Price, now 70 years old and without his counsel position or his lending power, accepted the ruling without appeal and paid the ordered restitution from his remaining assets. He lived quietly in Silver Creek for another 4 years and died in 1886 of natural causes. And at his funeral, which was attended by fewer people than his prominence in the town's earlier history would have predicted, the Reverend said words about a complex life, and the attendees maintained the particular silence of people who are being respectful about something they are also relieved is over. Josephine's legal and financial column in the Silver Creek paper ran for 3 years before she expanded it into a small handbook that Hatch printed and distributed, a practical guide to lending agreements and property claims written in plain language for ordinary people, and which became widely enough used in the surrounding counties that it was eventually reprinted twice. She was proud of it in the specific, uncomplicated way that people are proud of things that were genuinely useful, and when the second reprinting was requested, she rewrote several sections to reflect the changes that had occurred in Texas property law in the years since the original, which gave her a particular satisfaction. The column in the paper eventually became something broader. Josephine wrote about the life of the hill country, about the land and the people on it, about the injustices that continued to exist, and the small, partial victories against some of them, about the particular quality of a life built with hands and intention in a specific landscape. She had a reader's mail that was larger than any other column in the paper, and she answered a portion of it personally, because she understood from her own experience what it meant to receive a direct and honest response from someone when you were trying to figure out how to survive. In the spring of 1883, their daughter was born, arrived in a thunderstorm on a Saturday morning with the kind of dramatic atmospheric accompaniment that later became one of Samuel's favorite parts of the story. They named her Clara, for Josephine's aunt, for the woman who had left land along the creek to a niece she believed would one day find her way to it, which was a faith that had turned out to be exactly correct. Clara Bishop had Jasper's dark eyes and Josephine's auburn hair, and from approximately 8 months of age had an expression of acute discernment when looking at something new that made Pearl Cutler say, the first time she saw it, "Oh, that one is going to be interesting," in a tone that balanced admiration and mild wariness in equal parts. Samuel Bishop, 3 years old, considered his sister with the particular mix of suspicion and fascination that older children bring to new siblings, and within a month had appointed himself her most enthusiastic audience when she was being amusing and her most vigorous protector when she was upset, which was a dynamic that remained essentially stable for the rest of their childhoods. The ranch in those years had a specific daily texture that Josephine would later describe. When Samuel and Clara were old enough to be interested in the story of their parents' lives before they arrived in it, as the most sustaining kind of richness, not luxury but depth, the richness of things that matter because they are real and connected and chosen. The early mornings with coffee on the porch and the hill country light coming up. The work of the day, physical and financial and relational, the cattle and the accounts, and the conversations with ranch hands about practical problems that had practical solutions. The evenings at the cedar table with the lamp burning, and the children in the foreground and the book in the background, and Jasper reading, and the window dark with Texas night beyond. There was a period in the middle years of the 1880s when the cattle industry in Texas underwent pressures that were felt across the entire hill country: overproduction, falling prices, drought years that reduced the grasses and strained the herds. The Bishop Ranch felt these pressures, and Josephine and Jasper navigated them as they navigated everything, together and with full information, making difficult decisions about which cattle to sell, and when and what to reduce and where to hold. It was not easy. There were months that were tight and decisions that kept them at the cedar table late into the evening, working through numbers that did not comfortably resolve. But the foundation they had built, the financial reserves that Josephine's careful management had accumulated, the breeding decisions that Jasper's knowledge of the cattle had made, the genuine quality of the operation that translated to better prices from reliable buyers, held them through the hard years in a way that many neighboring ranches were not held. And when the cattle market recovered in 1888 and the drought years broke with 2 seasons of good rain, the Bishop Ranch emerged from the difficulty intact and in some ways strengthened, the way certain materials are strengthened by pressure. In 1885, 5 years after Samuel's birth and 2 after Clara's, Josephine found herself expecting again, and this time she told Jasper in the evening, on the porch, with the summer dark around them and the katydids loud in the live oaks, and she watched his face go through the same progression it had gone through twice before: the quiet, the complete feeling, the real and undefended happiness. And she felt, as she always did with him, the specific gift of being with a person who does not perform his inner life, but simply has it, openly, in front of you, so that you always know where you stand. Their second son arrived in early 1886, and they named him William, and he was from his first weeks a calm and watchful child who observed everything with a steadiness that reminded Josephine, with a fullness of feeling she could not always contain, of his father. Samuel was 6 and Clara was almost 3, and they received William with the particular mixture of ceremony and practical investigation that was their combined style. And the Bishop Ranch house, which had been built for more people than had initially sat at it, was now full in the way it had perhaps always been waiting to be. Jasper looked at his 3 children one evening in the spring of 1886, Samuel at 6 reading a book at one end of the cedar table, with the unself-conscious concentration of a child who has grown up with reading as ordinary pleasure. Clara at nearly 3 having an involved conversation with a wooden horse that expressed complex narrative developments. Josephine was only partially following. William asleep, in the cradle that Jasper had made from cedar the winter before. And he looked at all of it for a long time without saying anything, and then looked at Josephine, who was looking at him. "I think about where I was in 1878, he said, "how the house felt." "How did it feel?" she asked. "Functional," he said, "complete in its parts, but quiet in a way that was not right." He paused. "Not wrong, but not what it was supposed to be." Josephine looked at her husband. This man she had walked into in a feed store on her second day in Silver Creek. This man who had stood in a lamplight room and said, "She has my name now, so every problem of hers is mine," with a steadiness that did not waver. This man with the real laugh and the cedar table and the real love. And she said, "I think about Tuesday, September 24th, 1878. He raised an eyebrow. "The day I arrived," she said. "I was in that stagecoach and I had the debt ledger and I was calculating whether I could survive 60 days without losing everything. And I had a plan, and the plan was mine, and I was going to execute it alone because I had done everything alone for 4 years and I knew how." She paused. "And then 2 days later I walked into a feed store and dropped all my papers." "I was in the way," he said. "You were exactly in the way," she agreed. "And everything changed." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the light of the lamp with their children and the cedar table and the Texas night. And the door that had moved on its hinges that October evening in a rainy overhang, and had been moving steadily ever since, was fully open, and had been for a long time, and the life on the other side of it was entirely, completely, exactly what it was supposed to be. The land along the creek, Clara's land, Aunt Clara's land that a man had tried to steal through a forged document, and a fraudulent debt, became something particular in the Bishop family's landscape over the years. Jasper built a small structure there in 1887, a simple room with a porch and a window that faced the water, nothing elaborate, but solid and positioned to hold the view perfectly. He built it for Josephine, because she went there regularly to think and write, and because he understood without being told that a person who had fought to keep a piece of land has a relationship to that land that deserves to be honored in practical ways. She used the writing room for the rest of her life. She wrote her columns there, and her handbook, and later other things, letters to people she knew, and to some she did not, correspondence with the lawyers in Austin and the editors of papers in San Antonio and Austin, who began publishing her work, and eventually a longer piece about the history of fraudulent lending practices in Central Texas that was published in an Austin journal in 1889, and which had a measurable effect on the regulatory conversation around property law in that period. She wrote some of it about love, too, though not always explicitly. She wrote about what it means to build something with another person, about what it means to be in a country that can be both brutal and beautiful in the same afternoon light, about what a woman carries into a marriage and what she should be allowed to keep of herself, and how those things are not in opposition but are in fact the same thing, that what you bring whole into a partnership is what makes the partnership whole. She was writing at the Creek Room one October afternoon in 1888, 10 years after arriving in Silver Creek, when Jasper rode out to find her and stood in the doorway of the small room with his hat in his hand, the way she had first seen him, the way he had stood in the town hall when he said the words, and he looked at her desk in the afternoon light with the creek audible behind the room and the live oaks outside. And she looked up and saw his face, and saw the thing in it that was always there when he looked at her, which had not diminished in 10 years, but had deepened into the kind of feeling that does not perform itself but simply exists, constant and essential as the land. "What are you writing?" he said. "About us," she said, "among other things." He came in and sat in the other chair, and she turned to face him, and they were quiet for a moment in the October afternoon, and then he said, 10 years. 10 years, she agreed. "I would do it exactly the same," he said, "every day of it." She looked at him with the green eyes that caught the light, and the auburn hair that she still wore pinned back, and the face that had the particular peace in it that comes from a life that matches the person living it, and she said, "I would too. I would arrive on that stagecoach and walk into that feed store on purpose if I had to do it over, knowing everything." "Even the debt," he said. "Even the debt," she said, "because the debt brought me here." He smiled, the real smile, and she felt it in the entirety of herself. And outside, the October wind moved through the live oaks over the creek that ran through land that was hers and his and theirs. And the sun began its long decline over the hill country, and the Texas afternoon held them in its golden light. And there was no part of it that was not right, and no part of it that was not real, and no part of it that was not exactly what they had each, separately and together, been building toward from the very beginning. Samuel Bishop, at 8 years old, was already showing Josephine's precision with numbers and Jasper's feel for the land in a combination that made both his parents quietly certain about what his future held. Clara Bishop, at 5, had the acute discernment and the auburn hair and a personality so fully formed, and so entirely her own, that her parents frequently exchanged glances above her head that contained equal parts pride and mild awe. William Bishop, at 2, was calm and steady and observed the world with dark eyes that missed nothing, and would grow into a man much like his father in the particular quality of his character, quiet in words, absolute in action, entirely trustworthy in the doing of what he said. They grew up on that land together, those three, shaped by the limestone and the live oaks and the creek and the specific atmosphere of a house built by parents who had chosen each other for real reasons, and honored that choice every day in the way that they were with each other and with the world. Not perfectly, no life is perfect, and the Bishop family had its difficulties and its hard seasons and its losses as all families do, but truly, which is a different standard and a better one. In November of 1888, exactly 10 years after Jasper Bishop had stood in the Silver Creek Town Hall and delivered the words that would define him in that community for generations, he and Josephine rode out together on a clear morning to the edge of the property, where the land turned toward the creek, and they sat their horses side by side at the top of the limestone ridge, where the view opened out to the blue hills and the sky. And the November air was cold and clean, and the whole country lay before them in its irreducible reality. "I keep thinking," Josephine said, "about what Price thought he was doing when he set up the whole scheme. He thought he was taking land from people who couldn't fight back. He was right about most of them," Jasper said. "Most of them couldn't." "But not all of them," she said. "No," Jasper agreed. "Not all of them." She looked at the view, her aunt's land below them, the creek catching the light, the house visible in the middle distance with its porch and its cedar and its rooms full of children and work and the accumulated reality of a chosen life. "I think about what it cost, the fight. The money, the legal machinery, the time." She paused. "And I think it was completely worth it, not just for us, for every family that got their property back through the precedent. For the people who will never have to face that particular trap because it doesn't exist anymore." "It was worth it," Jasper said. "You took it on without hesitation," she said. "You stood up in that room and said, 'She has my name now, so every problem of hers is mine.' You didn't negotiate it with me first. You didn't ask my permission. You just said it." She looked at him. "That was the moment I understood you completely." "I meant it completely," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I understood." He looked at her on her horse in the November morning, this woman who had arrived on a Tuesday with a leather bag and a debt and a plan to survive alone, this woman who had built a life with him that was nothing like anything he had known was possible when he was 21 years old, fighting to keep the ranch afloat after his father's death. This woman who kept books and rode the ranch perimeter and wrote about justice and raised their children with honesty and laughed at the same things he found funny and read his silences as fluently as his words. And he felt it again, as he had been feeling it for 10 years without diminishment, the specific gravity of a love that is not performance or convenience or habit, but something you chose with your eyes open and would choose again and again without any revision. "Josephine," he said. She looked at him. "I have something to tell you that I tell you every day," he said, "and every day I mean it more than I did the day before." She smiled with the full, wide smile, the one he had been earning for 10 years and still worked for. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. "Jasper, completely, without reservation, for all of it." The November wind moved through the live oaks, and the creek ran over its limestone bed below them, and the cattle moved in the fields, and the house stood solid on its foundation of cedar and stone and intention, And Jasper Bishop and Josephine Bishop sat their horses at the top of the ridge in the cold blue morning and looked at what they had made. And it was good, and it was theirs. And it was entirely real, and it was not finished. And that was the best part of all. It was not finished. It was ongoing. It was alive. It was the continuing choice of every morning when you wake up beside someone you would choose again and again, and do not have to be talked into choosing. And the Texas sky above them was enormous and clear, and the land extended in every direction toward the horizon that always promises more. And the story of them was not a story with an ending, but a story that had simply reached the place where stories find their truest form, not conclusion but continuation, not arrival but the full, warm, undeniable understanding that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly the person you are supposed to be with, doing exactly the life you were always meant to live. And somewhere in Silver Creek, at the newspaper office on Main Street, the weekly column by Josephine Bishop was already set in type for the Friday edition, and would be read by 400 people in that small Texas town and passed along to others in the surrounding counties. And in it, she wrote about land and law and the particular courage required to hold on to what is yours, and between every line, in the specific quality of the prose, was the unmistakable signature of a woman who had found her place and knew it and would not be moved from it, and who had found, in the most unexpected way and in the most unexpected person, the one thing that makes all the other things possible, a love that was chosen freely, held firmly, and built daily into something that would last.